We're now going to proceed to questions and discussion. We have about a little less than a half hour. And I want to again ask that you sign our mailing list for UNAC so you can hear about all the actions that we're taking part in. And take a look at that cartoon that I passed out, which sort of summarizes what the U.S. is doing today. You had a question.
The first question is, in terms of taking a diagram, which is the way I look at it, of all these disparate events, is the unified theme to basically, you know, from the U.S. standpoint, the taxpayer standpoint, is you're creating liabilities on the part of the U.S. taxpayer, tangibly and intangibly. Tangibly in terms of dollars, intangibly in terms of risk of these people coming in and taking retaliation, for an asset that is essentially privatized. So in the case of Iraq, the Iraqi national oil companies, national resources are transferred to the cronies of Cheney. In Ukraine, Biden's son and Heinz, stepson of Kerry, is getting the gas distribution system. In the case of Afghanistan, the resources associated with metals are going to affiliates of Chase. So are they privatizing the assets, creating the public liability, and then doing that all over the place? Even in the case of Syria, you're doing it for Qatar and Saudi Arabia in terms of putting the pipeline through. So is that the case?
So, we're going to have a bunch of questions, and then the panel will,
Okay.
in a wind-up, sort of answer the ones that are directed at that. I think there's no other way.
Okay. So we have one question. People have taken notes. Yes. You.
Okay, I have a question for Jeff, actually. I think it was a point you made about Egypt, and talked about how, like, the U.S.-backed coup in Egypt put it kind of the military dictatorship back in power. It was already in power, but to take out a democratically elected leader, being Morsi. I guess I was having some, like, skepticism about the role that neoliberalism has played in the Muslim Brotherhood, and how kind of, you know, Morsi was going to accept like a $5 billion loan from the U.S. I'm just curious of how that plays in, because the U.S. will say one thing, like they condemned the coup, but then they still back the military billions of dollars. So I'm just kind of confused on that. I guess the role of, like, capitalism propping up either side and given them.
Okay, why don't we have a couple more, then have some our panelists respond.
Yes, because I want to ask about the U.S. discourse of counterterrorism, which of course has a long history. I want to ask what's new. As everybody here will know and remember, perhaps back in the 70s and 80s, this term was thrown at potentially any resistance to U.S. imperialism around the world. But since 9/11, it's become more pervasive and perhaps even more differentiated. And it's being increasingly thrown at various forces in Africa to justify the extension of U.S. military presence and alliances with regimes there. And in various ways, it justifies state terror. It also creates new kinds of instabilities. I mean, we all know about blowback from 9/11, but there are local blowbacks, including Syria. So I wanted to ask, how do we now understand this much more differentiated strategy of global counterterror, and how, I mean, it's easy to be satirical about it,
Can we
but
leave it at that?
how do we analyze this for the purpose of trying to delegitimize U.S. intervention throughout the world?
Thank you. Woman back there.
I don't understand how the U.S. can, with a straight face, be against self-determination. I mean, Crimea was part of Russia for hundreds of years. They speak Russian. The majority of the people living there wanted to be part of Russia. Germany, there were two Germanys after World War II for many decades, and we lived with that. I think it's obvious that Ukraine, which is the largest country in Europe, should be split in two and have a West Ukraine and an East Ukraine. And I don't understand why we don't push for a real democratic plebiscite from the people who live in this area. I don't think East Ukraine and West Ukraine should be forced to be one country.
If we're going to have some response,
Can I take any more?
let's just have a response now, and then I said we would.
Yeah, a good question. In Egypt, there were three candidates in the first election, and the second candidate lost. No one got it. So they did a runoff between Morsi and the military's candidacy, and Morsi won. And Morsi is the head of the Muslim Brotherhood that had been given a certain dispensation under the military dictatorship. It was allowed to function economically within limits. It had its own layer of multimillionaire and billionaires. And there were two aspects to it that are critical to understand. The first is that as a pro-capitalist formation, it had no way that it could implement the needs of the Egyptian people, although some foolish people on the left called Morsi the right wing of the Egyptian revolution. That is, he was part of a revolutionary process. So Morsi did nothing. He refused to pass a trade union law, but it did nothing to infringe on capitalism's rights. But at the same time, the United States, which was shocked that its military candidate was not elected, essentially huddled with the military and said, give us a year and we'll discredit him. And that they did. So, for example, all the IMF loans that he applied for had massive strings attached, which would have required him to implement even more austerity than before. Plus, the military, which controlled 40% of the economy, essentially cut off the fuel supply, cut off food supplies, cut off water supplies to Cairo in order to fuel the discontent in the country, and blame it on Morsi. So Morsi had two contradictions. One, he was being undermined by the real power that controlled 40% of the economy, by the world banking system that refused to grant him loans other than those that would be required to undermine his own state. And that's why he became unpopular. And the United States and the military used that to mobilize innocent people. But others, all the bourgeois opposition parties and pro-military parties, were the ones that mobilized on June 30th. Okay, the second question is on the Ukraine, on Crimea. They had 85% of the people voted in the Crimean referendum. There was one person dead in the entire takeover. The entire army of the Ukraine in Crimea went over to the Russians, but mostly by fraternization, and they voted 97% to leave. That was one aspect, but they did that because they understood that there was a neo-fascist-led coup, that they were subject to austerity, that they received letters in the Ukraine saying that their houses were going to be taken over by Svoboda troops who were going to come into the country, and anyone resisted would be met with violence. So they left. But there are other aspects to the Crimea. One is that the Russians that have now annexed it with the support of this referendum have said control 26,000 square miles of offshore rights, which is rich to the tune of trillions of dollars of offshore oil. And they're very concerned with that, and so was the United States oil companies. So the Russians now have control of those offshore resources. In my opinion, the Russians are not good guys in the sense that they have any interest in advancing the Ukrainian people's interest. They, Putin, supported the May 25th referendum in the Ukraine. They asked the people in eastern and southern Ukraine to call off their elections. They are a process of constant negotiation between the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Kerry on how to negotiate a solution. And the solution is to maintain some of the Russian interests in the country in the east, including manufacturing and fracking and oil and so on, and have some form of greater autonomy in order to maintain Russian capitalist interests in the country. And that's what's being negotiated behind the backs of the people. What's missing in the Ukraine is a party that fights for the interests of the working class itself. a mass revolutionary socialist party that is independent of and opposition to the oligarchs, whether they be Russian or former Russian, in the Ukraine. None of whom, both of those groups are more than willing to collaborate with U.S. imperialism or the Russian capitalist state. So that's the main thing that's missing there. And finally, on your question, today the war on terror is a even more vicious form of the anti-communist crusades of the McCarthy era. You mentioned terror, and it justifies the sending of U.S. troops anywhere. Invasions and demonization of every single country. Africa is being recolonized. And I use the word cautiously because it was never fully decolonized, in the sense that although they put a black mask on the white face of the previous imperialist nations throughout Africa, they were still under imperial economic control. The former countries did that. So today, the United States is trying to recolonize it against the interest of its competitors in France and elsewhere. Nigeria is oil rich. Libya has 4% of the oil in the world, and that's why they went into that country. Libya was liberated, Tripoli, by Qatar, but Qatar has no army. Qatar has a literally Blackwater privatized U.S.-funded army that marched its troops to supposedly liberate the country after they destroyed the whole thing. In Iraq and Libya and so on,
Let's hear from
let
somebody.
me just finish the sentence. If you look at the fine print of every one of the oil agreements, I mean the fine print, it's the basic U.S. corporations that control those oils. Even though they say in Iraq it went to Britain, it went to France, it went to this, the fine print say that the real wealth of those countries is in the hands of American imperialist oil corporations, the most powerful and the richest in the world. The United States didn't spend billions and kill 1.5 million Iraqis in order to give the oil democratically to their capitalist competitors, believe me.
Are there other panelists who'd like to respond to that? Okay, we'll
I'd like to
take-
hear some more questions.
We're
Yeah.
going to take questions now. Okay, who would like to ask a
I have a
question?
question.
Yeah.
I came in late, so I have addressed this earlier. My question, it's actually two questions. It's, the first part of it is, how do we re-energize and regain the spirit and the legacy of the African American people as being hugely anti-war, anti-imperialist, and because you talked about the new face of the empire, so I missed that, and from where I stand, the new face is something that has been very paralyzing. So fast forwarding, when we have a commander-in-chief who has genitalia that is different from the 46 predecessors or 45, how do we deal with that? So how do we, because again, people are going to be paralyzed. The females, Hillary or whatever she.
Further questions? Yes.
There were 600 American troops that landed in Sicily last month. 4 days before a dissident General Hifter in Libya decided to lead a coup, a so-called coup. And it indicates to me, this is part of that same covert strategy, because you could believe in a law of perpetual coincidences. But General Hifter lived in North Virginia, right near a certain headquarters of a certain agency called the CIA. This is the covert face, as you're saying, of American imperialism. I think, and with Boko Haram, it's interesting that they fought in Mali and received training in arms from weaponry that was being sent down from Libya into Mali. So, the the interconnections are all there. We have to point those things out. I think two things. We have an absolute decline in the anti-war movement since 2008, and that's not coincidental. I think one of the reasons is what you're saying here with the covert wars and the style. People aren't immediately affected, don't immediately see it. And also, I think there was massive illusions in Obama that demobilized any kind of anti-war movement. Those two things kind of dovetail.
I think most of us here have read, reviewed the same resources and references. Somewhat with Sarah Flanders, more with Jeff. I mean, we can conceptualize plans that have been put in place with Egypt, the overthrow coup, with capitalizing and monopolizing oils. And I think most people who read the same references and resources would agree that these plans are radical, profound. But I think what you're suggesting or hinting at is that they've succeeded, that they have monopolized, they have installed a puppet regime within Syria, within Egypt. And I think that's a vast leap of the kind of capabilities and abilities of the United States administration to say that we conceptualize their plans, but isn't that kind of a big leap saying that they've actually succeeded in those plans?
This was also my question, the instability.
Would you care to comment about the recent speech by Obama at West Point, in the sense of, are we looking at something qualitatively different, or, as was mentioned in the panel, something progressive escalation, destabilization? I don't know. I would love to hear from you about that.
Okay. That should wrap us up. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on a few of the questions briefly. The brother here who asked about the role of African Americans in opposing war, but not only war, but also all forms of social injustice inside the United States. And I think the presence of the Barack Obama administration, in a way, has put serious impediments to that traditional anti-war sentiment in the African American community. There is a reluctance, particularly on the part of certain political segments inside the United States, to actually oppose the president. I mean, there's a rationale that says that if we lean too hard on the president, that it will, of course, bolster the right wing, whose approach is fundamentally racist towards the president. His fundamental foreign policy is really no different than previous presidents. The Bush administration, for example, the United States Africa Command was initiated under the George Bush administration in early 2008. It had wide opposition on the African continent, but at the same time, under Obama, it has been strengthened and enhanced. There are more U.S. Special Forces, more drones, more CIA and State Department personnel right now operating in Africa than there were under the Bush administration. So I think this is something that we have to deal with honestly. And not only the African American community, but other communities inside the United States have also, to a certain extent, been paralyzed by the Obama administration, which fundamentally is carrying on the same imperialist agenda. And also the same domestic agenda in terms of austerity and political repression against the people of color communities and also working class and poor people in general. Poverty is going up. Actual unemployment is going up in the United States. Those figures they put out every month about the jobless rate really don't take into account that the labor participation rate inside the United States has declined drastically, even under a Democratic administration. The question of the role of Khalifa Haftar, he has been a CIA operative for well over 30 years. So his involvement in Libya, he was flown back there at the beginning of the counter-revolution in February and March of 2011. And of course, the United States of course has a role in what's going on right now. They could stop him tomorrow if they wanted to, because he has worked for them for many, many years. And they are in the process, we found out a few days ago, mobilizing at least 1,000 troops to possibly evacuate U.S. citizens or being involved in some type of aerial bombardment of forces that they had worked with previously. These same so-called al-Qaeda elements, like the Islamic Fighting Group and others, served as the ground troops during the Pentagon NATO bombing in 2011. And they can strike against them if they want to. The question of Boko Haram, I think it's complex, because on the one hand, it does reflect the tradition, well, I won't say traditional, but the regional fracturing of Nigeria that was instituted as a result of the legacy of British colonialism in West Africa, the whole process of indirect rule, where they allowed people from the north to predominate in the military, people from the south, certain groups were given higher degrees of Western education, were able to enter the civil service, people in the West, of course, being heavily involved in the commercial sector of the economy. So they, as Jeff pointed out, and Sarah as well, they manipulate these regional differences, which are an outgrowth of the post-colonial process, in order to destabilize these countries and, of course, justify and provide a rationale for U.S. military intervention. The whole question of Nigeria having the largest economy in Africa has to be looked at very skeptically. There's mass poverty there. There's joblessness there. The infrastructure has not been built up, despite the fact that you have billions and billions of dollars being generated in oil revenue every single quarter. I mean, Nigeria has some of the most high-grade crude oil in the world, and that's what the U.S. wants to control. Plus, China, several years ago, signed some agreements with the Nigerian government to develop refineries and other forms of modernization in the Nigerian oil sector. And they, of course, want to block Chinese intervention as well. And finally, the Obama speech the other day at West Point, in my opinion, it really represents no fundamental shift in the overall imperialist outlook of the United States. He says, oh, we're bringing the troops home, but at the same time, 10,000 U.S. troops are still going to be on the ground in Afghanistan. They still have these mercenaries who are there that are financed indirectly through U.S. Taxpayer dollars. So basically, there's really no worsening economic crisis that exists in this country and internationally. We see what's being imposed in Southern Europe, the austerity, the same type of austerity that they're imposing in Detroit, where I'm from. A tax on pensions, privatization of public assets, driving down wages, and so forth. So we don't disagree in that regard.
Yeah, there is an escalation regardless of who's in the White House, because their situation is more and more untenable. And just to particularly focus on the man in the back who asked a question, this is not in any way a done deal. Not one of these plans and not one of these wars has succeeded in their aim. As a matter of fact, every one of them has been a disaster. The U.S. really assumed they could walk into Iraq and take over. There was no military left. The country had been starved down to nothing, completely dislocated, and they literally did have to pull out. It did not go according to plan at all. Afghanistan, the poorest country in the world at the time, and no government to speak of, and yet more than 10 years later, here they are still unable to stabilize their situation. Libya, it seemed easy after just destroying every city from the water system to the electricity, and they have not been able. So not one of these wars are succeeding.
Yeah, but who controls the assets of those places you just mentioned?
Well, that was why I went back to Goldfinger. If they can't control it, they want to take it off the market totally and destroy it. And that is what has happened in many of these countries. If they can't, and while at the same time allocating huge money in the name of our money from right here in the U.S., it goes to private contractors, huge corporations, on rebuilding programs that are just handouts. But I want to address also, in terms of Egypt, with everything that the Muslim Brotherhood may have been willing to make and sign, all kinds of arrangements and deals, didn't see themselves as a revolutionary anti-capitalist force. They had a very different agenda. But nevertheless, the U.S. is threatened by any popular-based movement in the world. And any move for self-determination, unless it's a totally staged and manufactured thing, like in South Sudan or something like that, Croatia, or, you know. But if they can't control it, they are threatened by it. So why the overturn in Egypt was they felt they couldn't trust Morsi because of his base from below was very rooted in the poorest part of the Egyptian population and what austerity, what the U.S. wants in terms of the banks and cuts further on the subsidies. They didn't feel they could get through him. So it's the feeling that these aren't reliable movements for they want. I wanted to just touch on in eastern Ukraine, because we should always be open to new possibilities in the world, because there will be resistance. There not only will be plans that go astray, and the Pentagon wall industry of setting up people's militias. This is a challenge. You wouldn't expect it in the Ukraine with what's going on, and yet if somebody had asked you even a few months ago, is this possible? You wouldn't have thought that. So the response to the fascist movement, and it's a combined thing. You will see red flags and Russian flags side by side. It's a mixed group. Is there one line? Is there one view? Is there one party? No, but this is an explosive situation, a kind of a dual power. Dual power is inherently unstable. It can only be for a time, so we will see. The one problem that Putin and Russia, the Russian oligarchs themselves, may want to make a deal with the U.S. Absolutely. What's the alternative for them?